August 1211. Somewhere in the mountains of what is now northern Hebei province, China. A Mongol general named Mukali stands in front of his men. Behind him, a narrow pass cuts through the mountains like a wound rock walls rising on both sides, the path barely wide enough for a column of men to move without touching shoulders. Above him, the ridge called Yehuling. In the Mongolian tradition, you name a place after what lives there. The foxes live here, wild foxes roaming a desolate, windswept ridgeline at the edge of the known world. The ridge of dead foxes. On the other side of that ridge, 300,000 soldiers of the Jin dynasty are waiting. 300,000. Let that sink in. That is not a number pulled from thin air. The Jin Empire had mobilized what was at that moment one of the largest armies on the face of the earth. Cavalry and infantry siege engineers, supply trains stretching for miles. The full military might of an empire that controlled northern China, that had humiliated the Song dynasty for a century, that ruled 30 million people from Manchuria to the Yellow River. 300,000 soldiers dug in waiting, using the mountains to funnel any attacker into a killing ground. And Mukali has maybe 90,000 men. Before he leads them into the pass, he turns to Genghis Khan, his commander, his lord, the man he has followed across half of Asia, and makes a promise. He says simply, "I will not return alive if I do not defeat the Jin army." And then he takes his men into the dark. What happens next in the passes of Yehuling on a summer morning in 1211 will not just decide a battle. It will set the trajectory of a civilization for the next 200 years. An empire of 30 million people, one of the wealthiest, most sophisticated states on earth, will in the course of a single campaign season lose half its army. Its emperor will be murdered by his own general. Its capital will be besieged for 4 years. And within a generation, the Jin dynasty will cease to exist entirely. It all starts here, at the Ridge of Dead Foxes. But before I tell you what happened in that pass, I need to tell you why it happened. Because the Battle of Yehuling is not really a story about tactics. It's not even really a story about Genghis Khan. It's a story about a great empire that had been rotting from the inside for decades, and one man who knew exactly where to push. Stick with me on this. I promise it's worth it. The Jin dynasty. Jin, meaning gold in Chinese, was founded by a people called the Jurchens. And to understand why they lost to Genghis Khan, you first have to understand what they were before they won. The Jurchens came from Manchuria, the cold-forested northeast of what is now China. They were hunters, horsemen, semi-nomadic tribal warriors who spoke a Tungusic language and organized themselves in clan-based military units. For generations they lived under the thumb of the Khitan-led Liao dynasty, which extracted tribute from them, exploited them, and generally treated them as a conquered people with few rights and no future. Then, in 1115, a chieftain named Wanyan Aguda decided he had enough. He united the Jurchen clans, launched a war against the Liao, allied with the Chinese Song dynasty to the south, and in less than a decade had dismantled one of the most powerful dynasties in East Asian history. By 1127, the Jin had not only crushed the Liao, they had turned on their former Song allies, invaded northern China, captured the Song capital of Kaifeng, and taken the Song emperor himself as a prisoner. This is an extraordinary story of conquest. A small group of tribal warriors from the forest edges of Manchuria, within the span of 2 generations, had become masters of the most populous region on earth. And that is exactly where their problems began. Because the Jurchens conquered China, and then China conquered them back. Not militarily, culturally. About 3 million Jurchens migrated south into northern China. Over 2 decades, a small ethnic minority, now ruling roughly 30 million people. And the only way to govern 30 million people, to collect their taxes and run their courts and manage their bureaucracies, is to adopt the tools of the civilization you just conquered. So the Jurchens did. They embraced Confucianism. They implemented the Chinese imperial examination system. Their emperors wrote Chinese poetry and studied the classics. They moved their capital from the northern forests to Yanjing, modern Beijing, in 1153, leaving the homeland behind. They took Chinese names. Now I'm not going to pretend there was nothing admirable about this. The Jin dynasty oversaw a genuine cultural flowering. Confucian scholarship revived, arts flourished, there was real governance and real prosperity under the best Jin emperors. Emperor Shizong, who ruled from 1161 to 1189, is remembered as one of the great administrators of the era, a man who oversaw economic growth grain surpluses and a period of relative stability that earned his reign the label of the Jin's Golden Age. Under his son, Emperor Zhangzong, the arts reached genuine heights. Painting, literature, music, the Jin court was not a barbaric backwater. It was by any reasonable measure one of the most sophisticated royal courts in the medieval world. But here is the brutal military reality: the Jurchens, in the process of becoming sophisticated Chinese administrators, forgot how to be Jurchens. The men who had shattered the Liao cavalry with raw ferocity from horseback were by the early 1200s sitting in examination halls writing essays on classical texts. The Jurchen military unit system, the Mengan and Muke hereditary warrior farming households that had been the backbone of Jin military power, had been allowed to decay. The land grants that were supposed to sustain Jurchen warrior families had been sold off, divided and absorbed into the general agricultural economy. Men who were supposed to be soldiers had become farmers and merchants and officials, and the soldiers manning the Jin frontier were no longer Jurchen warriors at all. The border garrison troops by 1211 were largely Khitan and Kumoshi auxiliaries, men who had been conquered by the Jurchens themselves a century earlier, men whose loyalty to the Jin dynasty was, shall we say, negotiable. That detail is going to matter enormously. Remember it. The other thing you need to understand is that the Jin dynasty had spent decades manufacturing its own worst enemy. For generations, Jin policy toward the Mongol tribes to the north was simple and effective: divide and rule. The Jin would play different Mongol clans against each other, fund their rivalries, occasionally launch punitive raids to keep them weak and scattered. When a Mongol leader got too powerful, the Jin would support his enemies. And when that wasn't enough, they'd just destroy him directly. The clearest example of this is what happened to a Mongol leader named Ambagai Khan in the mid-12th century. Ambagai was captured by the Tatar tribe, another steppe people with close ties to the Jin, and handed over to the Jin imperial court. Now there were things you could do with a captured enemy chieftain. You could ransom him, you could imprison him, you could even execute him quickly if you wanted to make a point. Emperor Shizong of Jin chose to nail him to a wooden mule. A wooden mule was a torture device, essentially a large wooden frame shaped roughly like a donkey. The victim was mounted on it, hands and feet fixed in place and left there. It was designed to be slow, humiliating and agonizing. It was a statement: this is what we do to people who challenge us. The Mongols remembered. They always remembered. Ambagai was the ancestor of Genghis Khan. Not his direct father, but in the Mongol tradition, the deaths of clan leaders were grievances passed down through generations, obligations of vengeance that could never be forgiven and never forgotten. When Genghis Khan knelt before the sky, deity Tengri, in 1211 and recounted the generations of grievances his people held against the Jurchens, Ambagai's name was on that list. This was not rhetoric. This was belief. This was the fuel in the engine, and there were more wounds. The Jin had conducted regular punitive expeditions into the Mongolian steppe, not just political manipulation, but actual military raids designed to kill, enslave, and terrorize Mongol communities into submission. Chinese sources record these as deliberate policy. The Jin would periodically sweep north of the border and reduce the Mongol population by force, a brutal practice sometimes called reduction, that was explicitly designed to prevent any steppe confederation from growing strong enough to threaten the frontier. Genghis Khan had grown up in a world shaped by these raids. He had experienced directly and personally what Jin power meant at the sharp end. His father Yesugei had been poisoned by Tatars who were allied with Jin interests. His family had been abandoned by their tribe, leaving a 9-year-old Temujin to survive on berries and small game in the steppe winter. He had been captured and enslaved for a period. He had spent years of his youth as a fugitive, a man with nothing in a world where Jin power loomed over everything. The Jin dynasty did not create Genghis Khan, but it created the world that made him. And it created 60 years of fuel for the fire he was about to light. And beyond the symbolic wounds, there were structural ones. The Jin dynasty's 1194 Yellow River flood devastated its agricultural heartland, displaced millions of peasants, disrupted communication networks, and fomented unrest that the dynasty never fully recovered from. The river actually changed course, and when the Yellow River changes course in northern China, it doesn't just flood farms. It destroys the entire infrastructure of the region: the roads, the canals, the grain storage facilities, the population distribution that armies depend on for supply. The Jin spent the better part of 2 decades trying to manage the aftermath of that flood. By 1210, just as a severe famine was also gripping Jin territory, the Mongols appeared on the northern horizon. The timing could not have been worse. The empire was hungry. Its logistics were strained. Its border troops were drawn from resentful subject peoples, and its newest emperor was a man who had no business sitting on a throne. When Emperor Zhangzong died in 1208, the Jin court faced a succession question. By traditional rules, the throne should have passed to Zhangzong's elder brother, a man later known as Emperor Xuanzong. Instead, a court faction managed to install Zhangzong's uncle, a man named Wanyan Yongji, as the new emperor. Wanyan Yongji had been born to a concubine of Balhae ancestry. He was from the moment he took the throne an emperor whose legitimacy was disputed. His successor would eventually strip him of the imperial title entirely. History doesn't even record him as a proper emperor. He's remembered today primarily by his princely title Prince Shao of Wei. Let me be direct about this: Wanyan Yongji was a disaster. I don't say that with the benefit of perfect hindsight. The people around him knew it. Genghis Khan knew it from the moment he heard about the succession. When Yongji had attended the Kurultai in 1206 as the Jin representative, the assembly that had proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, he had reportedly given off the impression of a dull, solemn, ineffective man. Genghis Khan filed that impression away. 5 years later, when this same man took the Jin throne, Genghis didn't need to reassess. He already had his read. The Jin's own high court officials, men who should have been the most loyal defenders of the dynasty, began defecting to the Mongols during this period specifically because they could see the writing on the wall. These were educated, experienced bureaucrats who had spent their careers inside the Jin system. They knew its finances, its military capacity, its political divisions, and they were leaving. That is not the behavior of men who think their empire is going to win. That is the behavior of men making a rational calculation about which side is going to exist in 10 years. Yongji's strategic priority was entirely focused on the southern Song dynasty, the Chinese state that had been fighting the Jin for decades along the Huai River line. In his view, that was the real threat. The Mongols were nomads. The Jin had been managing nomads for a century. This was not a new problem. It was a nuisance. He was catastrophically wrong. But the tragedy is that from inside the Jin court in 1208, his position wasn't entirely unreasonable. The Jin had handled every previous Mongol threat through a combination of military force and political manipulation. No steppe confederation had ever successfully breached the Great Wall and held territory. There was no historical precedent for what Genghis Khan was about to do. Yongji wasn't uniquely stupid. He was operating on the logic of the past in a world that had just changed entirely. He was the perfect enemy. Genghis Khan could not have designed a better one if he'd tried. In 1206, at a massive assembly on the Mongolian steppe called a Kurultai, a man named Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler of all the Mongol tribes. The historian Timothy May calls what followed a social revolution. That's not an overstatement. The traditional steppe world was organized around clans and tribal loyalties. You fought for your family, your tribe, your bloodline. Genghis Khan destroyed that system and rebuilt it from scratch. His army was reorganized on a decimal basis, units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Commanders were appointed based on demonstrated loyalty and competence, not birth. A man of low birth who proved himself in battle could command a unit of 1,000. A noble who failed in the field could lose everything. The old tribal identities were deliberately broken up. Former enemies were mixed into the same units and told that their tribe was now the Mongol nation. And it worked. God help us, it worked. Think about what this meant in practice. The Mongol army that marched south against Jin in 1211 was not a horde. That word is a lazy shorthand that completely misrepresents what Genghis had built. It was a professional military force, organized with a clarity of command structure that most medieval armies couldn't match. orders flowed from the Khan through his senior commander's men like Mukali Jebe Subutai Jochi, and down through the decimal hierarchy to the individual soldier. Every man knew his unit, his commander, his mission. There was no ambiguity about who was in charge or what they were supposed to do. Compare that to the Jin army at Yehuling, where left flank commanders didn't know what was happening in the center because the mountains had severed communication, and you understand immediately why one system won and the other didn't. The Mongol military also traveled light in a way that was genuinely revolutionary. Each soldier was essentially self-sufficient, traveling with a string of horses, typically 3 to 5 per rider, so that when one horse tired, the soldier switched to another. This gave the Mongol army a strategic mobility that no army of comparable size could match. They could cover distances in days that would take most medieval armies weeks. Supply trains that would have slowed a conventional force simply didn't exist in the same way. The horses themselves were the supply train. By 1211, Genghis had done something no one on the Eurasian steppe had done in living memory. He had unified every major Mongol tribe under a single command. He had subdued the Western Xia kingdom to his southwest, forcing them into vassal status after a grinding campaign that taught him lessons about besieging fortified positions. He had secured the Uyghurs as willing administrators and suppliers. Critically, the Uyghurs had a written language and an administrative tradition that the Mongols lacked, and they became the bureaucratic backbone of the early empire. His flanks were covered, and crucially, his intelligence network was extraordinary. Merchants, defectors, scouts, disaffected Jin officials, they were all feeding him information about the state of the Jin dynasty. He knew about the famine. He knew about the succession crisis. He knew the border troops were Khitans. He had been watching and waiting and planning probably for years. This is what separates Genghis Khan from most conquerors. It wasn't just that he was ferocious, it's that he was patient. He didn't strike until he knew exactly what he was striking. And by 1210, he knew everything he needed to know. In 1210, a Jin delegation arrived at Genghis Khan's court with a message. A new emperor had ascended to the Jin throne, Wanyan Yongji, and per tradition, the surrounding powers were expected to send congratulations and reaffirm their tributary status. The Jin envoy expected Genghis Khan to bow to show the ritual submission that nomad leaders had performed toward Chinese emperors for generations. Genghis Khan turned to face south, the direction of Jin territory, and he spat on the ground. Then he mounted his horse and rode north, leaving the stunned Jin envoy standing in the dust. I want you to understand what this meant. This wasn't just rudeness. This wasn't a temper tantrum. In the diplomatic language of the medieval steppe, this was the equivalent of a declaration of war delivered in the most calculated, deliberate, maximally insulting way possible. He didn't attack the envoy. He didn't even address him directly. He just made it unmistakably clear that he recognized no authority over him whatsoever, and then rode away. It was contempt as policy. He also reportedly sent Yongji a direct message that the Jin envoy was too terrified to repeat verbatim upon returning to court. The gist of it, the emperor should be a man from the sky like me. I thought the ruler of the Middle Kingdom had to come from heaven. Can he really be a person of such weakness as Prince Wei? Why should I bow to him? Yongji received this message, and by all accounts was furious, which was exactly what Genghis wanted. An angry man makes bad decisions. The Jin's response when Yongji heard about it was to execute the Mongol ambassador, which diplomatically is about the worst thing you can do. You've just signaled to a man who was already looking for a reason to invade you that he now has an excellent one. In the law of the steppe and the code that governed relations between states across Eurasia, the ambassador was inviolable. You could refuse his message. You could send him away. You could even imprison him for a time. But killing him was an act of war so unambiguous, so beyond the pale, that it removed every diplomatic option from the table. There was nothing left to negotiate. There was only what came next. Genghis Khan's response was to go to the mountains above the Kurlan River for 4 days of prayer. He removed his hat and belt axe of ritual humility before heaven, and he knelt before Tengri, the eternal sky deity of the Mongols, and he recounted every grievance, every wrong, every murder and humiliation, going back to Ambagai, nailed to his wooden mule. He told the sky that he had not sought this war, that it had been forced upon him, that he was an instrument of divine justice, not a conqueror. On the fourth morning, he came down from the mountain and told his generals, "The eternal blue sky has promised us victory and vengeance. Now, whether you believe that or not is your business." But here's what matters. Genghis Khan believed it. His soldiers believed it. And when an army of 90,000 men believes they are executing the will of heaven against an enemy who has wronged them for generations, they fight with a ferocity that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. This wasn't just motivation, it was transformation. These men were not soldiers going to war. They were instruments of fate, and in battle there is a difference. A real, measurable battlefield difference between men who are fighting because they were ordered to, and men who are fighting because they believe the universe has ordained their victory. The Jin soldiers at Yehuling were going to find out exactly what that difference looks like. In March of 1211, Genghis Khan summoned the Great War Council, the Kurultai. Every senior commander, every vassal chief, every man who mattered in the Mongol hierarchy gathered on the steppe above the Kurlan River. And Genghis Khan told them what was coming. He mobilized 100,000 warriors. He left approximately 2,000 men, 2,000, to guard the Mongolian homeland. Over 90% of his total military strength pointed south at the Jin dynasty. This was not a raid. This was not a punitive expedition. This was existential commitment. He was betting everything on a single campaign. The strategic plan had three prongs. His eldest sons, Yoshi Ogedei and Chagatai, would drive through the eastern corridor toward Juyong Pass, the historic gateway to Zhongdu, the Jin central capital on the site of modern Beijing. A separate western force under Ogedei would attack sieging the Jin western capital at modern Datong to block any reinforcements from Shanxi coming to the aid of the main Jin army, and Genghis himself would lead the main force through the weakest point in the Jin defensive wall, a gap identified by his scouts near Wusha Fortress, which led through the desolate mountain corridor to a ridge called Yehuling. One more critical piece, a tribal chief named Alakush, leader of the Ongut people, who served as allies along the Jin's northern frontier, showed Genghis Khan a road through the border defenses that the Jin had never bothered to heavily fortify, a road they thought no enemy would ever use, a road through the desert and the mountains that would bring the Mongol army directly to the most vulnerable section of the entire Jin defensive network. The Onguts had been nominal Jin vassals. Now they were guiding Jin's greatest enemy to its soft underbelly. This was once again the ethnic fault lines of the Jin Empire cracking open under pressure. Before the army moved, Genghis Khan performed one more ritual act. He told his men that this campaign was not merely war, it was justice. That the Mongol people had suffered long enough under Jin arrogance and Jin manipulation. That every man who rode south was riding for every Mongol who had ever been enslaved, taxed, raided, or crucified on a wooden mule by Jin order. He framed the invasion not as conquest, but as liberation of the Mongol people from a century of Jin domination. And then in May of 1211, the army moved. If you want to subscribe to this channel now is a great time, because the story we're telling here, the story of how empires fall and how conquerors think, is exactly what this channel is about. Hit subscribe. Stay with me. The Jin dynasty's northern defense wasn't just the Great Wall, it was a system. The wall itself backed by a network of fortresses, watchtowers, and garrison positions manned by somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million soldiers in total across the entire frontier. The Jin Chancellor Duji Sejong had organized this defense and was personally overseeing it. On paper, it was formidable. The wall had held for decades. No enemy from the north had breached it in living memory. But here is the fundamental flaw in Duji Sejong's strategy. He spread his army thin. Instead of concentrating his forces at the points most likely to be attacked, he tried to cover everything. 800,000 infantry and 150,000 cavalry distributed along hundreds of miles of frontier meant that at any given point the wall was lightly defended. Genghis Khan's scouts knew this. They had been watching for months. There's a lesson here that transcends the medieval world and applies to pretty much any strategic situation. You can imagine a defense that tries to cover everything covers nothing. Duji Sejong had 1 million men. If he had concentrated even a third of them at the 2 or 3 most likely points of attack, he might have made the wall genuinely impassable. Instead, he chose to defend the line itself, rather than defend the outcomes that the line was supposed to protect. He was thinking about the wall. Genghis Khan was thinking about what was behind it. And Genghis Khan identified the weakest link, Wusha Fortress, a position that led directly into the mountain corridor toward Yehuling. The Jin had about 30 to 50,000 troops at this section of the wall, a fraction of the total force that Duji Sejong commanded, thinly spread without rapid reinforcement available, because the coordination system for moving troops along the frontier was simply not fast enough to respond to a Mongol advance. Between March and the end of June 1211, Genghis Khan hit Wusha Fortress with everything he had. The battle was not particularly close. Duji Sejong, to his credit, tried to rally his scattered forces, but the Mongol advance was faster than any reinforcement could travel. The Jin troops at Wusha were simply overwhelmed. The outer defensive network, the fortresses, the camps, the supply depots collapsed in sequence. The Mongol method of attack against fortified positions at this stage of the campaign was not the elaborate siege engineering they would later develop. It was speed and shock. They would advance faster than defenders expected, strike before reinforcements could arrive, and hit multiple positions simultaneously to prevent concentration. The Jin soldiers at Wusha found themselves engaged by a Mongol force that seemed to be everywhere, at once probing the walls, here striking the camp supply lines, there appearing behind positions that were supposed to be secure. It was disorienting in a way that static defenders are particularly vulnerable to, because their whole psychology is built around the assumption that the wall or the fortress makes them safe. When the wall stops feeling safe, the collapse of morale can be sudden and total. Duji Sejong was killed in action. The Jin chancellor, the man responsible for the empire's northern defense, died fighting a battle he had already strategically lost before the first arrow was fired. Most of his army died with him. Wuyue camp, the primary staging area behind the wall, was captured. The frontier was open. Simultaneously to the east, Yochi Ogade and Chagatai had stormed through the border fortifications with shocking ease and taken Juyong Pass, the great mountain gateway to Zhongdu. And in the far east, Jebe was driving deep into Manchuria. Before the end of the campaign season, he would capture the Jin eastern capital at modern Liaoyang. Jebe, known as the Arrow, was one of the most gifted operational commanders in the Mongol army, a man who had originally been an enemy of Genghis Khan before defecting and becoming one of his most trusted generals. The story of how Jebe came into Genghis's service is itself a remarkable one. He had shot Genghis's horse out from under him in a battle, and Genghis, impressed by the admission when Jebe openly confessed to it, made him a commander rather than executing him. That is the kind of leader who attracts men like Makali and Jebe, the kind who rewards honesty and talent over ego. The entire Jin defensive perimeter had been breached in less than 4 months. Every strategic calculation the Jin had made, the wall will hold the passes, will hold the eastern flank will hold, was wrong. All of it wrong. Here is where Genghis Khan does something that, to me, reveals more about his genius than any battle charge. After Wusha, after annihilating the Jin's frontier army and watching the entire northern defense system collapse, he stops. He rests his army for a month. He also sends an ambassador to the Jin imperial court. Now think about what this looks like from inside Zhongdu. The frontier is gone. The chancellor is dead. The eastern capital is about to fall. And the man who did all of this is sending an envoy to talk. It creates exactly the kind of confusion and false hope that Genghis Khan wanted. Are they going to negotiate? Is there a deal to be made? Should we send someone to find out? The month-long pause was not generosity. It was operational calculation. The Mongol army had just crossed the Gobi Desert, fought the entire Wusha campaign, and needed to rest its horses and resupply before the next phase. But the simultaneous diplomatic outreach transformed a logistical necessity into a psychological weapon. While the Jin court debated whether to negotiate, whether to concentrate their remaining forces, whether to reinforce the next defensive line, or pull everything back to Zhongdu, Genghis Khan's horses were eating, drinking, and recovering for the battle at Yehuling. The Jin scrambled. They replaced Duji Sejong with a new commander named Wanyan Chengyu, and Chengyu, who had inherited an impossible situation, made the best tactical decision available to him. He abandoned 3 cities, Hangzhou, Changzhou, and Fuzhou, consolidated their forces, and pulled everything back to the mountain defensive line at Yehuling. His logic was sound. If the Mongol cavalry couldn't operate in the mountain passes, their greatest advantage would be neutralized. What he did not understand, what he could not yet know, was that the mountains would neutralize him just as effectively as they would neutralize the Mongols. He had 400,000 men in those hills, and in about 2 months he would discover that 400,000 men in a mountain range without functioning communications might as well be 40,000 men in 4 separate battles. Let me paint you a picture of Yehuling, because the geography is everything. The ridge sits in what is now the northwest of Jiangjiakou Hebei province. It's a mountain pass, not a single point, but a series of interconnected heights and valleys, with narrow defiles cutting between them. The terrain is rugged, uneven, heavily forested, in places broken by ridges and ravines that limit visibility and fragment movement. To the northwest of Juyong Pass, this corridor was the last major geographic obstacle between the Mongol army and the North China Plain, the flat open heartland where Zhongdu sat. Whoever controls Yehuling controls the road to Beijing. In 1211, that was as true as it has been in every war fought in this region before and since. Wanyan Chengyu's plan made geographic sense. He positioned his enormous army at the foot of the ridge and in the mountain approaches, using the terrain to force any attacker into confined corridors where numbers and cavalry couldn't decide things. In open ground, the Mongols were devastating. In a mountain pass, the Mongols would be forced into a slogging infantry fight and Jin's numerical advantage would tell. The flaw, and it's a terrible flaw, is that the same terrain that restricted the Mongols also fragmented the Jin army. Communication in those mountains was slow and unreliable. The left flank didn't know what the right flank was doing. The center didn't know when the wings were in trouble. An army of 400,000 in complex mountain terrain is not one army, it's a collection of smaller forces that happen to be wearing the same uniforms. And Genghis Khan saw this. He always saw the thing his enemy didn't. There's a geographical irony at the heart of this battle that I find almost poetic. Chengyu chose mountains because he wanted to take away Mongol cavalry. He succeeded, the Mongols did have to dismount. But in taking away Mongol cavalry, he also took away his own ability to maneuver and communicate across a front that stretched for miles through broken terrain. He solved one problem and created a worse one. That is the kind of trap that intelligent commanders fall into when they are thinking about what they fear rather than what their enemy can exploit. After arriving at the foot of the ridge, Genghis Khan did something unexpected. He stopped again. For weeks, he held his position on the plain below Yehuling, making no major attack. He was trying to lure Chengyu's army down from the mountains and into a cavalry engagement in the open. In the flat ground below the ridge, Mongol horse archers would have been devastating. 100,000 mobile cavalrymen against 400,000 slow-moving infantry and cavalry in open terrain, Genghis would have ended it in a day. Chengyu didn't take the bait. He stayed in the mountains. And to be fair to him, this was the right call. He recognized the trap. He knew what Mongol cavalry did to infantry in open ground. He had the evidence of wuxia right in front of him. So he waited, and Genghis waited, and for weeks the two armies stared at each other across the plain with the mountains between them. Genghis shifted plans. If the enemy wouldn't come to him, he would find a way into the mountain positions that gave him the advantage of surprise rather than a straight frontal assault up defended passes. He needed intelligence. He needed to know exactly where the Jin units were, which positions were strong, which were weak, and whether there were any routes through the mountains that Chengyu hadn't properly covered. His scouts were already working, mapping the passes, identifying the gaps, but what he really needed was someone on the inside. Someone who knew the Jin deployment from the inside out. He was about to get exactly that. This moment, I have to tell you, is one of the most fascinating in this entire story, and it's a moment that gets overlooked in a lot of the broad strokes histories of the Mongol conquests. Wanyan Jin was the Jin field commander, the man directly in charge of the troops at Yehuling, subordinate to Chengyu, but commanding the forward elements. And Wanyan Jin made a decision that is difficult to defend in retrospect. When the Mongols first appeared on the plain below the ridge, he did not attack. He waited. He hesitated at exactly the moment when hesitation was fatal. There may have been a logic to it. He was waiting for Cheng Yu's orders, or waiting to see what the Mongols would do, or protecting a defensive position he was supposed to hold. But on the steppe and in these mountains, that kind of hesitation against Genghis Khan was death. The window of opportunity, if there ever was one, to strike the Mongols while they were still adjusting to the terrain, before they had fully mapped the Jin positions, closed, while Wanyan Jujin waited for instructions that arrived too slowly. And then, and this is extraordinary, Wanyan Jujin sent an official to the Mongol lines to open communications, perhaps to negotiate, perhaps to buy time, perhaps to signal that the Jin was open to some kind of deal. The official's name was Shimo Mingan. Shimo Mingan was a man of Khitan descent. He was a Jin official, educated, experienced part of the imperial bureaucracy. But he was also a Khitan. And the Khitans had been subjects of the Jin dynasty for a century, since the Jurchens had destroyed the Liao dynasty that the Khitans had built. For a century, Khitan officials had served Jin emperors, fought in Jin armies, administered Jin provinces, while knowing in some bone-deep way that they were a conquered people, serving foreign masters who had humiliated them. The Khitan soldiers in the Jin frontier garrisons had watched Jurchen officers take the credit and the promotions, while Khitans did the fighting. The Khitan administrators had watched Jurchen nobles hold the senior positions regardless of ability. This was not a system designed to generate loyalty. It was a system designed to extract service from people who had no other option. Shimo Mingan crossed into the Mongol lines. He knelt before Genghis Khan, and he did not come back. He defected. On the spot. Right there at the foot of Yehuling, Shimo Mingan looked at what the Mongol army had already accomplished. The frontier destroyed the eastern capital, falling the Jin's greatest general dead, and made the calculation that every rational man in his position might have made. He chose the winning side. And he gave Genghis Khan everything. The exact positions of every major Jin unit, the strength of the flanks, the location of Cheng Yu's command post, the weak point where a concentrated assault could break the center, the passage through the mountains at a place called Huanazui Badgermouth that the Jin had not adequately fortified. He told the Mongols that Wanyan Jujin's forward force was waiting at the pass, but had not been given orders to attack, that the flanks were out of communication range, and that the central command was positioned in a way that left it exposed to a direct thrust through the Huanazui passage. I want to pause here because this betrayal is not incidental, it is the story. The Battle of Yehuling was decided not on the field, but in the moment a Khitan official crossed from one camp to the other. And the reason he crossed is the reason the Jin dynasty fell, because 60 years of Jurchen rule had failed to build genuine loyalty among the subject peoples they depended on to defend them. The Khitans who staffed the garrisons, the Khitans who commanded the forward units, the Khitans who were supposed to die for the Jin, they had never truly been Jin. They were instruments that happened to be pointed in the right direction, and the moment a better option appeared, the instruments changed hands. Genghis Khan didn't just invade the Jin dynasty, he weaponized its own subjects against it, and that right there is what separates a great conqueror from a merely successful one. A merely successful conqueror wins the battles in front of him. A great conqueror understands the structural weaknesses of his enemy so completely that he can make the enemy's own people fight his war for him. Armed with Shimo Mingan's intelligence, Genghis Khan now had what he needed, a plan with a sharp edge. He sent Mukali and the Balu unit, a mobile elite strike force, through the Huanazui passage into the Jin center. The passage was narrow, the terrain was brutal, and the Mongols couldn't ride. So they got off their horses, and they walked into the pass on foot. Think about what that means for a moment. The single greatest advantage of Mongol warfare was their cavalry, fast, mobile, devastating at range and at speed. At Yehuling, on Genghis Khan's direct orders, they abandoned that advantage entirely. They dismounted and fought as infantry in terrain that was just as unfamiliar to them as it was to anyone else. This is tactical flexibility that is genuinely remarkable. These are horsemen who had grown up in the saddle, who fought their whole lives on horseback, and when the mission required it, they put down their bows, picked up their blades, and fought on foot, without complaint, without hesitation, without a breakdown in unit cohesion. That kind of discipline doesn't happen by accident. It happens because the men trust their commander absolutely. and because the training and the organizational structure are strong enough to function even when you remove the conditions the army was optimized for. Mukhali's oath echoed ahead of him. I will not return alive if I do not defeat the Jin army. The assault hit the Jin center before the flanking units could respond. This was the critical insight. The mountain terrain that Chengyu had chosen as his defensive asset had also destroyed his communication network. The Jin left flank didn't know the center was under assault. The Jin right flank didn't know either. By the time word could travel through those ravines and forest ridges, the center was already breaking. Wanyan Jujin, the field commander who had hesitated, who had sent Shimo Ming'an across the lines, who had made every wrong decision available to him, tried to hold the center. He rallied the troops around him, and by the accounts we have, he fought hard. He was not a coward. He was a man who had been outmaneuvered at every level, politically, tactically, and now personally, and he died on that ridge, doing what commanders are supposed to do when everything has already been lost. He died in action. And when the field commander of the center dies, and the center collapses, and there is no communication with the flanks, an army of 400,000 men stops being an army and becomes 400,000 men standing in the mountains, wondering what is happening. The collapse of the Jin center triggered what military historians call a cascade failure. The flanking units, already out of communication, began receiving fragments of information. The center is gone. The field commander is dead. Mongols are coming through the pass, and without coordinated orders, they began to do what armies do when their command structure collapses. They ran, and the Mongols pursued, relentlessly, mercilessly for miles. The historical sources say that dead bodies lay scattered for over 100 li, roughly 50 kilometers. That is not rhetorical exaggeration. That is what the aftermath of a total cavalry pursuit looks like when a 300,000-man army disintegrates. The Mongols were back on their horses now, and fleeing infantry against cavalry on open ground is not a battle. It is a harvest. The men who had survived the collapse of the Jin center spilled out of the mountain passes onto whatever open ground was below the ridge, and the Mongol cavalry was waiting for them. 50 kilometers of pursuit. 50 kilometers of men who had thrown away their weapons running for their lives and not making it. Wanyan Chengyu managed to escape. He pulled together the survivors, however many that was a fraction of the force he'd commanded that morning, and fell back to Huihe Fortress to the east. But as a fighting force, the Jin army at Yehuling was gone. Not beaten. Gone. The greatest military power in the Far East had been destroyed in a single summer morning. If you've been watching this far, and this story is hitting you the way it hits me every time I go back to it, drop a like. Seriously. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel bring more stories like this to more people. Wanyan Chengyu arrived at Huihe Fortress like a man who had survived a shipwreck. He had scattered remnants of the Jin army around him, soldiers who had fled Yehuling in ones and twos, who had abandoned their units and wandered through the mountains until they found the fortress. He had probably a fraction of what he'd started with. But he had walls. He had some provisions. And perhaps in the desperate mathematics of a losing commander, he thought maybe here we can hold. Genghis Khan arrived in October 1211. He did not give Chengyu time to think. The Mongols surrounded Huihe Fortress and hit it from every direction. For 3 days the Jin remnants fought, and to their credit, they fought hard. These were not the same men who had panicked and run at Yehuling. These were the survivors, the hardest ones, and they had walls behind them. But 3 days against the full weight of the Mongol army was all they had. On the final day, Genghis Khan himself led the decisive charge. 3,000 horsemen, the Khan at their head hammering into the last organized Jin resistance in the north. Picture that for a moment, the Khan himself at the front of the charge, not watching from a command position, but leading. This was Mongol leadership, not delegated, not managed from a distance. The man at the top of the hierarchy personally leading the breakthrough charge because he understood that leadership was visible, physical, and personal. His men had seen him ride into the front of engagements before. They would see it again. And it meant that every soldier in the Mongol army understood that there was no position in the hierarchy that was shielded from the actual work of war. The fortress fell. The last remnant of Chengyu's army was annihilated. Chengyu himself survived, but there was nothing left for him to command. The road to Zhongdu, the Jin central capital, the greatest city in the world, at that moment home to millions, lay open. And between it and the Mongol army, there was nothing. What happened after Yehuling happened quickly, and it happened badly. The Mongols didn't march straight to Zhongdu. After Huihe, they spread across the north, raiding through Hebei and Shaanxi, systematically destroying the agricultural and logistical infrastructure that the Jin needed to sustain a long-term defense. This is something Genghis Khan understood that many conquerors don't. Taking the capital doesn't end a war. Destroying the enemy's ability to supply an army ends a war. The raids of late 1211 and through 1212 weren't just pillaging, they were strategic targeted destruction of everything the Jin needed to rebuild its military capacity. Meanwhile, in 1213, Genghis Khan encircled Zhongdu. Before he even arrived at the walls, something astonishing occurred inside the city. Wanyan Yongji, the emperor whose arrogance had started this entire war, the man who had executed Genghis's ambassador and sneered that his empire was a handful of sand, was murdered. Not by Mongols. By one of his own generals, a man named Hushahu, who then seized control of the capital. An emperor murdered by his own general while a foreign army marches on his capital. If you needed a single image to summarize the complete institutional collapse of the Jin dynasty, that is it. The man responsible for the catastrophe died at the hands of his own people before the enemy even got through the gates. There is a certain grim justice in that, and I won't pretend otherwise. Hushahu installed a new emperor, Xuanzong, the man who should have taken the throne in 1208 in the first place, and then the siege of Zhongdu settled in for the long haul. What followed was one of the grimmest episodes in Chinese history. The city held for years, and as it held, it died. Food ran out. The population, millions of people, was reduced to eating whatever they could find. The historical sources record cannibalism inside the walls. People eating people to survive another day behind the stone that might protect them from the Mongols outside. In 1214, Emperor Xuanzong finally negotiated terms. The Jin would become a tributary state of the Mongol Empire. The price, enormous amounts of gold silk horses, and the emperor's own daughter, the Princess Chiguo, given to Genghis Khan in marriage. The ultimate humiliation, the daughter of the Jin emperor, as a bride price to the man who had just destroyed your army. Genghis withdrew. He apparently believed the worst was over. He was wrong, because Xuanzong then made the catastrophic decision to abandon Zhongdu and relocate the imperial court to Kaifeng in the south. The logic was defensible. Zhongdu was too close to the Mongol frontier, too difficult to defend. But the signal it sent was unmistakable. The Jin dynasty was abandoning the north. And the Mongols read that signal correctly. In 1215, Mongol forces returned to Zhongdu. The city that Xuanzong had abandoned, that he had declared was too dangerous to defend, had been left with a skeleton garrison and no prospect of relief. It fell. And when it fell, the Mongols did what the Mongols did. They looted it systematically and thoroughly. They burned what they couldn't carry. The great city that had been the capital of 30 million people, that had stood as the most sophisticated urban center in East Asia, was reduced to ash and ruins. It is reported that the ruins burned for weeks, that the smoke was visible from miles away, that the accumulated treasure of a century of Jin rule, the art, the archives, the gold, the silk, the accumulated wealth of one of the world's great civilizations was stripped out and loaded onto Mongol carts heading north. A Persian traveller who visited the site sometime after the fall described bones piled in mountains, the ground white with human fat, rendered by fire, a landscape of absolute desolation, stretching as far as the eye could see. Half of the Jin dynasty's total military force, some sources say roughly 475,000 of their roughly 950,000 troops, had been lost in the campaigns that began at Wuxia and ended at Zhongdu. 10 cities were plundered. The entire northern agricultural heartland was devastated. The population of northern China had been set on a trajectory of decline from which it would take generations to recover. The Jin dynasty didn't die at Yehuling. It took another 23 years. The Jin held on in the south, retreating behind the Yellow River, occasionally winning battles, occasionally inflicting real damage on Mongol forces. Emperor Aizong was a capable military administrator who extracted some real defensive victories from an already lost war. The dynasty showed more resilience than it probably deserved given its condition. But Yehuling was the wound that never healed. Every year after 1211, the Jin was smaller, poorer, less organized, more desperate. In 1234, the Mongols allied with the southern Song dynasty, the same Song that the Jurchens had beaten a century earlier, and delivered the final blow from two directions at once. The last Jin Emperor Aizong fled his burning capital and hanged himself when the Mongols finally cornered him. The Jin dynasty ended not with a dramatic last stand, but with an emperor committing suicide in a burning room because he refused to be paraded in chains through the streets. 119 years after Wanyan Aguda had united the Jurchen clans and declared the Jin dynasty into existence, it was over. Erased. The population of northern China had fallen from roughly 45 million to somewhere around 10 million by the time the dust settled. Cities that had taken generations to build had been leveled to the ground. An entire civilization, the Jurchen Jin, ceased to exist as a political entity and would not re-emerge until the Manchu Qing dynasty 4 centuries later. People like to talk about Yehuling as a story of Mongol military genius, and it was. But I think that framing misses the deeper lesson, and the deeper lesson is actually more interesting. The Jin dynasty lost this war for 3 reasons that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with the choices they made over the preceding century. The first is what I call the Sinicization trap. The Jurchens were a genuinely extraordinary martial people. In the 1110s and 1120s, they were probably the best cavalry fighters in East Asia. They were ferocious, mobile, adaptable, and organized around warfare in a way that most sedentary civilizations couldn't match. And then they conquered China, and they decided slowly, gradually, culturally, that being Jurchen wasn't as valuable as being Chinese, that the examination hall was more prestigious than the parade ground, that Confucian poetry was more refined than archery. By 1211, the Jurchen military class had largely dissolved into the Chinese bureaucracy. The men defending the northern frontier were Khitans. The empire had traded the thing that made it powerful for the trappings of the civilization it had conquered. That is a transaction you almost never recover from. I want to be careful here because I'm not saying that cultural development or the adoption of sophisticated governance is bad. The Jin dynasty at its best was genuinely impressive. But there is a specific military vulnerability that comes with the transition from a warrior culture to an administrative one, and the Jin never found a way to maintain both simultaneously. They couldn't be fierce nomadic horsemen and sophisticated Confucian bureaucrats at the same time, and when the fierce nomadic horsemen showed up at their border, they had forgotten how to respond in kind. The second is the ethnic time bomb. The Jin dynasty governed its 30 million people through a layered system in which Jurchens held the top positions, Khitans and Han Chinese staffed the middle and lower ranks, and everyone below the Jurchen elite had some degree of legitimate grievance. The Khitans had been conquered a century earlier. The Han Chinese had been conquered, their Song emperors humiliated. These people served the Jin because they had to, not because they wanted to. And the moment a credible alternative appeared, the moment Genghis Khan showed up with an army that was winning and a narrative about liberation and vengeance, the glue dissolved. Shimo Mingan's defection was not an isolated event. It was the visible symptom of an institutional failure that ran through every layer of the Jin military. Khitan officers defecting, Han Chinese officials switching sides, high court officials going to Genghis Khan and urging him to invade faster. The Jin didn't just lose the Battle of Yehuling. It lost the loyalty war it had been losing for decades. There's a lesson here for any organization, military or otherwise, that tries to build loyalty through hierarchy rather than through genuine inclusion. It doesn't work. People will serve you when they have to. They will fight for you when they want to. And the difference between those two things in a crisis is everything. The third is leadership vacuum. I keep coming back to Wanyan Yongji because his specific incompetence matters. A stronger emperor might have recognized the Mongol threat earlier, might have built genuine loyalty among the Khitan and Han subjects, might have concentrated the frontier defense rather than spreading it thin, might not have executed Genghis Khan's ambassador and handed him a perfect casus belli. Any one of those things could have changed the calculus. Yongji did none of them. He was a man in the wrong chair at the worst possible moment, and 30 million people paid for it. Now, what did the Mongols actually do right at Yehuling specifically? 4 things. First, superior intelligence. Between the scouts, the defectors, and Shimo Mingan's direct betrayal, Genghis Khan knew his enemy's positions better than the enemy's own flanking commanders did. Second, tactical flexibility. Dismounting and fighting on foot when the terrain demanded it, that's not a small thing. That is an army so well led and so well disciplined that they can abandon their core advantage when the situation requires it, without breaking, without questioning, without hesitating. Third, concentrated force at the decisive point. Mukali didn't attack everywhere. He attacked the center, the place where Shimo Mingan had told him the Jin line was thinnest and the communications worst. And fourth, relentless pursuit. The Mongols didn't win at Yehuling and then stopped to celebrate. They chased the broken Jin army for 50 kilometers. The 100 miles of dead bodies in those mountains weren't from the battle, they were from the pursuit. You don't give a broken enemy time to breathe. You finish it. That formula, better intelligence, total flexibility, concentrated strike, relentless follow-through, is Genghis Khan's playbook in every campaign he ever ran. And it worked every single time because his enemies consistently failed to account for all 4 elements simultaneously. They planned for 1 or 2. They never planned for all 4 at once, and Genghis always delivered all 4 at once. Yehuling was fought in the mountains above what is now Zhangjiakou, China, in the summer of 1211. If you drove there today, you'd find farmland and small towns, and a landscape that gives very little indication that 800 years ago, one of the most consequential military catastrophes in the history of East Asia happened there. The foxes still live on that ridge. The pass is still there. The wind still comes through it in August the same way it did when Mukali walked his men into the dark. But the effects of that summer never fully stopped rippling. The Jin dynasty's collapse destabilized the entire Chinese world. It pushed the Jin southward, destabilized the relationship between Jin and Song, and ultimately set the stage for the Mongol conquest of the Song dynasty itself, completed under Kublai Khan in 1279. The Mongol Yuan dynasty that emerged from Genghis Khan's conquests shaped Chinese culture, trade, and politics for centuries. The Silk Road reached its greatest extent under Mongol rule directly because of the conquests that Yehuling began. The demographic catastrophe in northern China, tens of millions of people dead or displaced, reshaped the ethnic, economic, and agricultural geography of the region in ways that were still visible a century later. And what about the man himself? Genghis Khan didn't stop at Yehuling. He never stopped. After consolidating his position in northern China, he turned west toward Khwarezm, toward Persia, toward the edges of Europe. The Khwarezmian campaign, launched in 1219, would become one of the most destructive series of conquests in recorded history. Cities like Samarkand, Merv, and Nishapur, centers of Islamic civilization that had stood for centuries, were reduced to rubble. The scale of destruction in Central Asia was so complete that some regions did not recover demographically for 300 years. He died in 1227, still campaigning, never seeing the full extent of the empire he had built. The Mongol Empire would eventually become the second largest contiguous empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary. It all started with a grudge. With a man crucified on a wooden mule 60 years before Yehuling, with a Khan who turned south, spat on the ground and rode north, Mukali kept his word. He did not die that morning at Huanazui. He went on to become one of Genghis Khan's most trusted generals, commanding the ongoing operations against the Jin dynasty for years after Yehuling, slowly strangling the last life out of the Jin Empire, one province at a time. He died of illness in 1223, still in the field, still fighting 12 years after the oath he made at the foot of a mountain pass. He never stopped. None of them ever stopped. That's who these people were. That's the machine that shattered one of the most powerful states on earth in a single summer. And the next time someone tells you that history is determined by impersonal forces, by economics, or geography, or population trends, remember Mukali walking into the dark at Huanazui, and Shimo Mingan crossing from one camp to the other, and a general kneeling on a mountain above the Kurlan River for 4 days asking the sky for permission to burn the world down. History is also made by what individual people decide to do at the moments that matter most. Never forget that. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I genuinely love seeing where in the world this channel reaches. And if you have thoughts on Yehuling, on Genghis Khan, on whether the Jin dynasty ever had a real chance against what was coming, I'll be in the comments. If this video earned an hour of your time, a like and a subscribe is how you tell the algorithm to put this in front of more people who love history. That's the game. Let's keep playing it. I'll see you in the next one.